Hey all, good morning. Okay, just firing this along to get us all getting more organized on the webinar series. So the webinar series I'm imagining are two webinars with an umbrella. Maybe Tessa can come up with something a little more sexy and fun than this, but the umbrella basically saying, how can technology allow you to maximize experiential learning on your campus? And so we're going to talk about technology sort of at two levels. And so I'm imagining the first talk being Karen, starting with the kind of idea that experiential learning used to be envisioned in off-site co-op experiences, co-op terms and stuff, but that technology can help us stretch that definition and actually bring experiential-like learning in places where it hasn't been before, and most specifically, right into our universities and into our classrooms. And so then I imagine her using Riipen as an example of how that can happen. You'll see, I think we have to tread carefully on, not being a product promotion per se. And I'm going to try to kind of give you the same feel of how I do that in this talk. So the idea would be Karen would do that one on, say, a Thursday, a 20-minute talk with 10 minutes Q&A after that. And then this talk that you're about to hear would follow on the next day, on the Friday. And we're literally talking next Thursday and next Friday, so we'll see if we can get this together already. So I am going to go into my talk proper, and I'm going to press start just so I can time it as I go. Here goes. Welcome. Thank you all for spending the time coming back. I hope you really enjoyed yesterday's webinar with Karen Bakker, and I have the privilege of continuing the discussion today. I'm Steve Jordans. I'm a professor from University of Toronto, and I'm a heavy user of educational technologies and a firm believer in experiential learning. So we're going to continue the discussion about how technology can help us maximize the experiential learning happening on our campus. I'm going to focus on something that I don't hear talked about too much, which is what can we do to make our experiential learning context successful? How can we prepare our students, and what role can technology play in preparing our students for these experiences? And I'm really going to focus on what I'm going to call technology-enabled peer assessment. I think that's the best way to go, but we'll get there, okay? So first of all, Karen's gone over some of this ground a little bit, but just to re-emphasize, in its purest form, work-integrated learning or experiential learning, they're subtly different, but experiential being more general. But often what we imagined in these contexts was the student leaving the institution and going into some other environment, and then really taking the expertise, the theoretical knowledge they got from their classrooms, and now applying it in real-world context with real-world problems. Very cool. Now, as Karen suggested, though, as we consider experiential learning more generally, and we're now imagining that the good things that come with a work-integrated kind of experience, well, maybe we could bring those good things to students in other ways. And so Karen spoke a lot about how we might actually bring experiential type experiences, it's hard to say that, experiential experiences, into the classroom itself, and the role technology may play there. Okay, so with that as context, we can start to think of what I'm going to call a continuum of experiential learning, where yes, on the right side we have the off-campus co-op kind of work terms. On the left side we have in-class, sort of more theory-driven, let's say traditional classes. And again, Karen was showing that with a technology like Riipen, for example, and I'm sure there are other technologies of the sort out there, we can start to think of this as a continuum where there are points in between, where we can have experiential learning happening in our classes. Cool. So first of all, why is experiential learning so important? I want to disentangle two things because I'm gonna key on one of them, sort of maybe with or without the other. So there's two things that make experiential learning powerful. One is that it really emphasizes skills, right? It's, okay, students get the knowledge in the classroom, but now they have to use the knowledge. And so that's requiring a whole different, knowledge versus skills are very different memory systems, very different cognitive systems. So we're now going to ask students to do things like think critically, think creatively, communicate, These are the reasons we like them in a real world situation, because they have to learn these real world skills of success. And so that's one of the reasons why experiential learning is so powerful. The other reason is that it also combines the skill work with authentic learning context. So context where the work that students are doing has value beyond the classroom itself. It's not just going to be graded by an instructor and then deleted, essentially, but rather the work they do will have continuing and ongoing value of some sort. And in those sort of authentic contexts, we know that students are more engaged, and they think about everything deeper, and so the learning is more durable and more powerful, right? So we have the authenticity and we have the skills, and that's fantastic. Okay, and that's why we're all so excited about experiential learning, and that's why we should be excited about experiential learning. It really does add another dimension to the learning, and one that is very connected to student success after graduation. Okay, now here's where I really want to kind of jump in. Yes, experiential learning is great, but how successful that experience is depends, and I say for both the student and the third party, whoever they're working with, it depends absolutely on how developed the student's skills are. Do we really want to send our students or have our students work with some external entity when they're not very good critical thinkers yet, or not very good creative thinkers, or not very good communicators? Do we want them to learn these skills in an experiential opportunity? Or wouldn't it be great if we could, thought of the day, develop these transferable skills, at least to some extent, in the sort of safer university context before we bring them to the authentic experiential context? And this is something I believe in strongly, that if we really want experiential learning to work, we have to be sending students who are ready, to be quite honest, who can really contribute to the authentic context we're putting them in. Because authentic contexts have all these great learning advantages, but they also have a responsibility component, right? We're having our students work on real issues. And so from my perspective, we'd really love them prepared. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on in this webinar. How can technology do that? How can it reach that goal? Okay, so the first thing I want to really stress is that we are talking about a different kind of learning here. Okay, I like to say you can learn a lot about karate in an hour, but if you want to learn to do karate, you're not going to be able to learn that in an hour. You're not going to be able to learn that in a week, a month, or even a year to some extent. But critically, the way to learn it is very different. So knowledge you can gain through simple exposure. Right? You can just hear somebody who actually presents some information in a very engaging way, or you can read about it, or you can watch a show, a video, and you've got the knowledge. It's there. So it can be, as much as one shot, so to speak. Skills, however, they develop slowly, and critically, they require what we call repeated structured practice. I'm going to emphasize that over and over. Think of like playing a guitar, or learning to dance, or any physical skill like that. You need practice, you need to repeat that practice, and you need that practice to be relatively structured. And especially if you're also getting some feedback along the way. This is the sort of magical context for developing skills, but of course, this is the challenge for us. How can we provide this kind of structured skill learning environment given the constraints of our institution? How do we find the time, and how do we fit it in with what we're already doing? Okay, there's a way. And that way, in my opinion, is through peer assessment. I think it's the best pedagogical process for giving students the repeated structured practice they need to develop these core transferable skills. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's a typical peer assessment kind of process, I guess. Imagine students are first asked to create some composition, okay, just like they normally would be. But then here's where the peer assessment, at least the first hit, can come in. After they create the composition, they see the compositions that some of their peers submitted. And I actually want to imagine they're seeing like 5 or 6 peer compositions. And imagine those compositions are presented anonymously, and that they're selected randomly from the class, so the student does not know who they're assessing, and ultimately the assessor will not know who assessed them. And we now charge the students with the task that's normally one that teachers do. Specifically, we say, we want you to look at each peer's work. We want you to consider it in detail, and we're going to structure your analysis. We're going to give you the structure to do that. And ultimately, the goal will be to provide each of your peers with fantastic and useful constructive feedback. Okay, so you're going to have to tell the peers something they could do to make their work better. Okay, so let's just imagine this for a second. So you're looking peer by peer, and you have to tell this peer something that will make their work better. Well, how do you do that? Well, step one, figure out what's suboptimal about the work. What could use improving? What do you use to do that? Critical thought, right? So once you've kind of identified the weaknesses, then you have to start to think about, well, how should it be done? How could it be done better? What could I recommend this person do to make this weakness stronger? Well, that's creative thought, right? And once you kind of come to a notion of what to do, now you have to communicate that to the peer. That is expressive communication. Okay, in this case, it's a very specific kind of expressive communication. It's the delivery of constructive feedback. So, critically, students do all this with the first peer, and then they do it again for the second, and then they do it again for the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and as many peers as you want. What is this giving them? Repeated, structured practice, engaging critical thought, creative thought, expressive communication. Okay. Now they're also, of course, seeing a bunch of work that their peers did, and they're very. It's a context that doesn't just encourage; it almost demands that they compare their own work to that of their peers. And some of that peer work will probably be better, some will be worse. And so now students are getting a really clear metacognitive signal about where their work fits, how good it is relative to their peers. And they're also, to the extent they see, oh, my work isn't as good as I thought, there's some other people doing great work, they're also getting very clear exemplars that they can use to help them develop. Okay? Cool. So now imagine students do this for 6 peers, let's say. While they're doing it for 6 peers are doing it to their work. So in a next step, if we really want to ratchet things up, then we can show them the feedback that their work received, but also ask them to do 2 additional things. Thing 1, assess the feedback in that same way they assess the original composition. That is, we can have a very structured analysis where we say, peer by peer, you have to go through the feedback and you have to analyze it. Maybe you have to pick out what were the useful things this person said. Maybe you want to have students respond to the emotional reaction they felt when they were reviewing that feedback. Or maybe you want it very structured. There are, in fact, some very clear notions about what good constructive feedback looks like almost a rubric of sorts. It should have the following components. And so you could ask students to literally be analyzing the feedback in that way. The critical point here is that they're, once again, engaging critical thinking. Do I agree with that feedback? Is it right? And then to the extent they do agree, now they're starting to engage creative thinking. Okay, how could I have made my work better then? And this is all in the context of receptive communication. Learning to shut up and listen, which is difficult for a lot of students. And again, they do that for the feedback from peer 1, from peer 2, from peer 3, from peer 4, etc. Once again, repeated structured practice engaging these core transferable skills. Okay. Now, the second thing we often will ask them to do in this last step is to, once they've analyzed all the feedback, revise your work. Use that feedback in a formative way to make your work better. Okay. And so this is a very, once again, this really involves, critical thinking. What do I change? Creative thinking. How do I change it? It's all now this context of the expressive original essay or whatever they wrote. So once again, more practice with these skills. Now, here's the really critical thing about this sort of approach. From the faculty perspective, they define the activity and they ultimately grade it. All of this repeated structured practice, everything that's going on in the assess and reflect phase is driven by the students. It's assessment as learning, active learning at its best. And you know what? Students like it. They appreciate it. They enjoy it. That's a problem with a lot of active learning approaches, is that to students it can often seem like more work. This is more work for students, but it's work that they appreciate. It's work that they value. Okay, so the point being that this fits into the constraints of our current system. A professor, instead of giving whatever activity they give, they could give it in this sort of context, and they get all this added pedagogical value. Students start to develop all these skills, and these will bode well for them. Now, I want to suggest to you, it's one thing that's nice to say, hey, there's a process out there. There's also technologies to help you manage this process, or to manage it for you, really. I myself am part of a team that's created one of these technologies called Peer Scholar. It's out there. I'll give you one just sort of quick taste of it so you have a sense. So what I've done here is I'm logged into the assess phase. So the idea is that students would have first submitted a composition, and now they're coming in, and this is the kind of context where they can anonymously see the work that their peers did. They can assess it with inline comments, but there's also this form that instructors create to guide their analysis of each piece of work. And it can include things like rubrics, by the way. In this case, we asked them to create an argument. So we could use an argument rubric and ask students to score this work based on the rubric. But once again, critically, they do all this work for Peer 1, and they do it for Peer 2, and they do it for Peer 3, etc. So they get that repeated, structured practice. Again, this isn't about Peer Scholar. I'd only show you that to show you that there are technologies that can handle all the logistics that are involved in a work like this, so that it's infinitely doable, should you wish to. Okay. Now, what does this do now? So we started by saying, the traditional experiential learning opportunity was the co-op, off-campus kind of experience. We suggested that with technologies like Riipen, you can, in fact, bring some of that experiential learning right into the classroom. And now what I'm adding is by saying, and hey, if we use technology-enabled peer assessment, then throughout this process, we can continually be working on our students' skill sets. Even before they ever encounter something in Riipen, maybe. Again, with the Riipen technology, we can be bringing this in right in the first year. But certainly, as they're kind of moving up to the continuum of more and more authentic experiential learning, while they're on that journey, we can be honing their skills. And so, as they come into more and more authentic contexts, they are prepared and ready to excel. That makes our third party very happy. They want to work with our students because our students are doing great work. And it maximizes the educational impact for our students. Okay, so as examples, these two technologies now can really take our experiential learning efforts and, well, do everything we can to both maximize the quantity of them for our students, but what I'm emphasizing here is the quality. If our students are prepared, it will be a better quality educational experience. Great. That's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. We'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. If you want to get in touch with me for any reason, there's some information to allow you to do it. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye. So by the way, guys, that was 17 minutes.